Lecture. Okay, so today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Natalia Rohatyn-Martin with us. She's going to be really talking about understanding fatigue in diverse classrooms. And this comes out of her PhD research, which was looking at students in junior high school and senior high who were deaf and hard of hearing, and she was interested in examining their perspectives on inclusion. And this is literature that was sorely lacking in the field at the time she did this research. But one of the topics that came up in her dissertation research was the idea of fatigue, and she hadn't set out to look at that, but sort of bookmarked it to come back to it. And she's now a professor at I should say an assistant professor, your proper title, at MacEwan University. And her major area of research right now is looking at fatigue. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Rohatyn-Martin, and she will introduce herself. Anna and I will sort of keep a look at the chat, but she can also let you know how she would like to handle questions. So over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayward. I'm not sure if they call you Denise or Dr. Hayward, so we'll go with that. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I get really excited to talk to, especially pre-service teachers, about the idea of fatigue, because I really do think that it's a concept that not a lot of us really think about in our daily lives and contribute to why students might be struggling in the classroom. So I'm excited to be here to talk to you today about it. So a little bit about me. There we go. So I grew up with an older brother who was deaf, which is kind of just thrusted myself and my family into more of an advocacy role when it came to individuals with disabilities. So it was kind of a natural progression for me after becoming a teacher, a third generation teacher in my family, to go back and decide to really look at research that focused on supporting students with disabilities in the classroom. And after working for a few years as a classroom teacher in elementary and junior high, I decided to go back and do my master's to really support students better in the classroom. And so actually before I was a elementary teacher, and then when I came back, I did a lot of junior high, because I found that's really where a lot of the support in the classroom was starting to really be lacking. And so after I did that, I decided I got the research bug, and I decided to go over to U of A and do my PhD there. That's my master's picture, but yeah, so I have a background in teaching. I taught for quite a while before I decided to go and do further education, and now, as Dr. Hayward said, I am teaching at MacEwan, and I'm teaching in the educational assistant program. So for those of you who will continue to do your work as teachers in the classroom, you might have some of my students coming to meet you to help support you in the classroom with your students. So it's a nice kind of little circle that we've made, a nice interwoven web, you can say.
I just add here, Dr. Rohatyn-Martin is also the author of chapter 3 in the inclusion section of the other ways of seeing inclusive education, and that's specifically on educational assistance. So you now know another one of the authors.
Yes, you can put my face to my name, absolutely. And once we eventually get around to doing that video, once this COVID business is over, then we can focus more on that. But yes, that is me. So nice to meet you all. Hopefully I hear a little bit more from some of you as well. When you have a question, feel free to just interrupt. You can put it in the chat. If you'd like to turn your camera and your microphone on to speak with me one-on-one, that would be great as well. Don't be shy. And I'd love to hear your name and a little bit about you if you're asking a question too, just so maybe I can give a little more perspective in that as well. So jumping right in. So I actually used to be an instructor for 301 as well, and I actually started off by being Denise's TA in the class. So her and I have worked together for quite a while. So Anna, you might be you might be stuck in this role for quite a bit, or hopefully willingly. But when Denise and I were actually involved in one of these classes one day, we were getting ready for the lecture. And at the time, I know now the Amy Mullins video for you is part of one of your assignments. At the time, we were showing it in the class. And we were getting ready to go, and we had the video up and running. And then all of a sudden, the audio halted for the track. And we weren't really sure what to do at this point. We couldn't get it working. You know how technology can be finicky, especially at the U of A. So after a few minutes of trying to figure it out, and we couldn't figure it out, we decided we're just going to allow the students to watch this video purely with the subtitles, and we'll see what happens. And so after about 5 minutes of the students watching it with just the subtitles, we noticed that a lot of students were looking restless. They were starting to look around the classroom, closing their eyes, no longer taking notes, just purely checking out. And we talked about this with the students afterwards, and we asked them how they felt. And they talked about feeling drained. They had to stop watching as their eyes were getting tired. They were really aware what their body was doing, so they were blinking more to reduce their eye strain from having to watch the subtitles the entire time. And then we started talking about the idea of, if this was the reality for you, how would you feel about this? And one student said, you know, I feel bad for students who might have to go through this on a daily basis because I'm just exhausted. And you know, really rarely in our daily lives do we stop to really consider cognitive, visual, auditory, or attention demands within everyday educational lessons. And so for me, as Denise had said, I typically do my research with students who are focused on students who are deaf or hard of hearing. But when it comes to fatigue, I've spoken a lot with teachers lately, and it seems that fatigue is really affecting a lot of students in the classroom, especially now with having to move sometimes to Zoom. There's a lot of Zoom fatigue, but particularly for students with different types of disabilities or neurodiversity, they're really being affected. So students with ADHD, students who have some types of learning disabilities, they're starting to really come around to this idea that they're feeling really fatigued in the classroom, and this is really being shown in different ways. So for a lot of us, we need to think about how diverse students in our classrooms, students with diverse learning needs, have to cope then for up to 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, where they have to focus simultaneously on the information we're presenting as teachers, sometimes auditorily, sometimes visually, and then sometimes with overlapping or multiple speakers at the same time. So thinking about how they have to keep focusing in these different types of settings. So really, what is fatigue then? There's really a lot of different definitions that we found in the research, but for the most part, the definition that I've chosen to go with is an overwhelming sense of exhaustion and decreased energy for a certain amount of time, despite adequate amounts of sleep. So there is some research that tells the difference between simply tiredness and fatigue. And so you can see the difference here, but basically tiredness can be resolved with sleep, with either a nap or a good night's sleep. You don't feel that sense of tiredness anymore. Whereas with fatigue, it's more of a constant state. And then simply just taking a nap isn't going to alleviate all those symptoms that you might feel. It's often misunderstood and misinterpreted, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but especially by classroom teaching teams. And it can be defined in two different ways. So there's subjectively being able to define fatigue, and objectively. So subjectively, fatigue is defined as a decline in the efficiency of someone's focus, concentration, and alertness. And then objectively, it's defined as a decline in someone's performance because of sustained or prolonged demands. And then what we found in our research is that there's really 3 types of fatigue that students will talk about. So there's physical fatigue, cognitive fatigue, and then social emotional fatigue. So physical fatigue is defined as exertion in an activity that can lead to some type of muscle strain. So for a classroom example, you could think about typing at a computer for an extended amount of time that eventually gives you a muscle cramp in your hand, your arm, something that is related to that typing, or maybe even eye strain from having to focus on the screen for so long. Or even auditory or visual exertion for having to either listen or watch something for an extended amount of time in a noisy classroom. And we know that classrooms today, well, all classrooms really, are notoriously loud in itself, right? So if you're having to focus, I'm thinking specifically for students who might have attentional demand issues, or for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, who have to listen over some of this noise, it can be extremely fatiguing for them as well. So there's also cognitive fatigue, which would be more of focusing on those demands for really having to think and focus and concentrate in the classroom. So eventually that would lead to decline in attention or concentration. So typically when you think of cognitive fatigue, there's been research to say that there are 3 aspects that can really contribute to mental fatigue, and that's the time available you actually have to complete a task. So that can contribute to how much you're focusing or really concentrating on something. The psychological stress related to maybe an inability to complete a task. So you're now focusing and worried about how you're going to be able to get this done. And then potentially a lack of experience with the task, or have the idea of the task difficulty as well. So all these things can contribute to cognitive fatigue and how someone is focused or starting to have a decline in attention because of that. And then there is social emotional fatigue. And this is when students have been focusing for so long that now their emotions are starting to kind of catch up with that. So you might see students start to act out. You might see them feeling some type of depression or acting out in some way, or maybe even completely removing themselves from the situation because they just feel like they can't cope with it anymore. So this is another image that I found that really speaks to kind of what I was talking about. This is from Glaus and Hammond, and they were focusing on individuals who were actually in treatment for cancer and looking at fatigue levels in their patients. And as you can see, there's 3 similar areas of fatigue that they found with their patients. Affective fatigue, which would be that social emotional, physical, and then cognitive. You can see, or you can think about how the numbers that they have, how much it affected those individuals might differ slightly from those students in the classroom. For example, individuals who are undergoing cancer treatments, their majority of their fatigue was physical fatigue, which you can understand because they'd be putting more effort forth to trying to do things like sitting up or walking, or depending on what type of treatment they're going through. Whereas we would see numbers in the classroom more focused generally on that cognitive fatigue, especially if we're looking at sitting in the classroom work for students that way. But you can see some of the examples that they reported, which would be very similar to examples that we've seen in our research for students in the classroom as well. So normally when I'm in person, I have us do a think, pair, share, but because you're not really able to pair on Zoom, we'll just do a think and share. So feel free to put some comments in the chat or to raise your hand, unmute, and come on and talk about it. But I'd like you to look at this list of symptoms of fatigue and think about by the end of the school day. So right now you're a student. So at the end of your school day, after going through your classes, how many of these can you identify with? Can you identify with them all? Can you identify with 2 or 3? But think about after a day of sitting in lectures, whether it's in person or on Zoom, how many of these symptoms do you feel yourself? So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that, and then please feel free to unmute and share or put in the chat.
I can relate to most of them. I have ADHD, so when I'm feeling fatigued, my concentration just goes completely out the window. I become super agitated, disorganized. I can't problem solve at all. So yeah, a lot of these are really, really hitting home.
I don't know if you can see the chat, Natalia, but we've got things like poor impulse control, all of them. Some days are better than others, but I think I felt all of them at some point. Poor concentration, yes, all of them, pretty much all of them. I also feel very hungry after class. I can relate to that, Brett.
That's great. That also might be because it's a noon class and it's lunchtime.
Thirsty as well, but Brett could be in the morning session because this is a combined guest lecture.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Oh, and Monica says hungry in class.
Which could lead to those emotions that people are feeling as well. I often get hangry, so.
Yeah, exactly. Those ads, those sneaker ads would be good advertisements here.
That's right. So yes, a lot of you say a lot of things, some of them for sure. I often talk to a lot of teachers and ask them the same question. Yes, crankiness, I see Sadia as well. I talk to a lot of teachers who I ask them to think about their experience of simply teaching in the classroom and how they feel after a day of teaching. And again, a lot of them list all of these symptoms of fatigue. So I want you to think about, as a student then, some of you with maybe diagnosed disabilities, maybe some of you without, but still the majority of you are saying that you have a lot of these symptoms. How then do you think that the students in your classroom, particularly those with maybe attentional needs, who have different neurodiverse brains, those who are deaf or hard of hearing, how do you expect them then to feel this way, maybe even by the time lunch hits, and then to sit for 3-4 hours more in a school day, and we ask them to sit there and be at their best? Right, we can see then how this would affect students in the classroom, and how there might be different things that we're just simply misinterpreting as that students are acting out, they're being defiant, they have attentional issues, when really they could just be overloaded and fatigued. So something for you to ponder. So when it comes to fatigue, there are 2 main ways, especially for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, but I've noticed more and more that when I've been looking into it with individuals with different learning needs as well, that there are 2 main ways that you can really feel that fatigue coming in. So there's auditory effort and visual effort that you would need to put forward, especially in the classroom. So auditory effort is the cognitive exertion, so the energy, basically the cognitive energy that you need to use to attend to and understand a spoken message in the classroom. So this is coming typically from the teacher or the teaching team, maybe even their peers in the classroom, but it's the way you need to focus auditorily to understand a spoken message that's being said. And again, spoken messages in the classrooms are often processed and understood in that presence of noise, right? We know that there's often classmate chatter, there's squeaking of moving chairs, there's ridiculously loud ventilation systems, pencil sharpeners sometimes, hallway noise, all these things that we know a classroom is never quiet in itself. Even when it's quiet, it's not quiet. So this all has to be done with this auditory effort and through this noise with this auditory effort. And it's funny because a study back in 2004 by Goldberg and McCormick Richburg said that younger students in general, so thinking of elementary school students, Div 1 in particular, perform more poorly in noisy classrooms than adolescents, regardless of their hearing ability. So regardless of whether someone is deaf or hard of hearing, has a cold, whatever that's affecting their hearing, they tend to do worse in loud classrooms than adolescents do. They have a really hard time discerning what's important information to be taking in when there's something around them really distracting them. So something, again, to keep in mind when we're in a classroom, especially if we're there with the younger students. And then, of course, thinking on top of that, if younger students in general have issues listening and comprehending through noise, then how does that fare for other students with disabilities who might have, again, attentional needs or who are deaf or hard of hearing? And then the second effort to really focus on is visual effort. So this is the physical and mental exertion required to visually attend to or comprehend a message. So instead of listening for those messages, now spoken messages, this is now that visual side. So a classroom example could be looking at the person who's communicating the spoken message, so watching someone, reading a textbook for an extended amount of time, watching a video, watching a demonstration, something like that. So fatigue can result because either the auditory signal in amplification devices for students who use that isn't equivalent, isn't the same as actually hearing through, if you have quote unquote normal hearing for students. And often they're using, so students who are deaf or hard of hearing in particular are often using that visual effort to really help support that, looking to have that auditory message given to them. So they're really relying on visual supports if all you're doing as a teacher is just standing and communicating a message. So, and for anybody who communicates through a visual language such as American Sign Language or a different kind of sign language, the visual effort could also be heightened for them as well, as they typically need to focus on an interpreter in the classroom as well. And they're simultaneously trying to flip back and forth between watching a teacher and then going back to an interpreter. So these are two really important ways to focus on understanding how fatigue can be impacting students in the classroom. I see a couple things in the chat. Are there any questions?
I think it was related to your slide where you were asking about fatigue.
Perfect.
Symptoms, yeah.
Okay. There is a raised hand. Monica?
I was just wondering if you could speak to mindfulness. My daughter in grade 8 is coming home and saying they're practicing mindfulness, and it's after lunch and it's calming, and they put their heads on their desks. Like, can you expand about what mindfulness would look like in a classroom?
Yes, actually, Monica, if you don't mind holding on to that for about 10 minutes or so, when I start talking about things that can be done in the classroom, I can definitely put mindfulness in with one of the slides, and I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about breaks.
Okay, sure thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monica.
We can't hear you, Natalia.
Sorry, thank you. I was just saying, I'm really happy to hear that that's actually happening in the classroom. That's really great. So I look forward to talking about that when we talk about breaks. Okay, so fatigue in educational settings. So that was kind of an overview of fatigue, but when it comes to educational settings, we found I found in our research, and also other research has communicated that students are often disregarding their fatigue symptoms. They're internalizing it by saying, oh, it's my fault, I stayed up too late. You know, they don't think about it as them actually having to work harder in the classroom, and this is why they're fatigued. They're often shown to have maladaptive coping strategies, and I'll talk about those, or you'll see those as examples in a little bit. And they minimize the consequences of this on their academic success. So they say, oh, you know, I'm just going to take a little break. I'm going to leave the classroom for 5 minutes. But they don't realize that if they're doing that 5 times a class, there's actually gaps in their education there of what they're missing when they're outside the classroom. So they don't really see how serious that could actually be on their academic success. And then with educational teams, so us as teachers, EAs, interpreters in the classroom, we often misconstrue their ineffective coping behaviors as a lack of motivation. So we see, oh, they're putting their head down in class, or they're leaving to go to the bathroom 5 times a day. We just see that as, oh, maybe they're defiant, they have no motivation to work, and we're inaccurately really describing them in a way that is that can be detrimental to how we actually perceive these students, right? And then we might have this bias against these students in the end. So we really need to be careful about understanding the supports and the needs of our students. And we also fail sometimes to recognize the importance of educational supports that can really help mitigate some of these feelings or these symptoms. So for example, when I was working with students who are deaf or hard of hearing, I've been told by several of them that some teachers in the classroom refuse to wear the FM microphones. There was one teacher who actually said that they thought it was jewelry, and he said, I don't wear jewelry at all, so I'm not going to wear this. And it took the mom coming in, the principal to speak to this teacher for them to actually start wearing a microphone, or the FM microphone. And even at that point, he was wearing it incorrectly. He just didn't care. And so it's that impact that some teachers don't actually see how that detrimental that can be for a student, because that's their access to education at that point. So previous research on fatigue, there's 3 different types of studies that I've found. So there's fatigue focused on students with physical or medical, medical needs. For example, cancer patients, students with learning difficulties. There's been 2 studies that I've found on students with learning difficulties, and then students who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so we found that many studies will actually mention fatigue as kind of a side effect, or they'll talk about the effects of fatigue, but they won't focus on how the fatigue can actually impact the student or their education. And then we found too that students aren't actually looked at as key informants, and being given the recognition for them to say when something's being potentially disadvantageous or is compounding those effects in the classroom. So they're not being given the space to actually share their experiences and say, yes, this is what has been affecting me in the classroom. And without that student voice, personally, I feel like their outcomes related to social needs, academic needs, vocational needs are really compromised in that situation. And so, of course, then this research would be valuable for all of us, right? Educators, policymakers, parents, even students themselves. They need to understand how fatigue in the classroom can significantly impact their education.
And just a quick question. What can we do in order to help with that? Because so in my practicum, I saw that one student needed to wear that device in order to amplify the voice of the instructor, of the teacher, but she happened to be in a split class. So, and also she had two teachers at that time. So because they were co-sharing that class. But one of them, I noticed that she would wear it, but the other one would not wear it. And I don't know if there was actually, an agreement between of them or the principal as well to see if they both needed to wear that. So I didn't know. I just observed that. And as you're saying, yes, it's going to be detrimental to the student. So the student was really great and lively, and I wore it for her, and I tried to give her more attention knowing that she couldn't hear very well, but how can we help?
Yeah, so later on in my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what you can do as educators. But in that instance, it would be if you were one of the teachers, because I can't really talk about the agreement that maybe they would have had or didn't have. But if there is one teacher not wearing the device and still teaching the class, then that's not providing the access that that student needs. They can be sharing the microphone to be able to do that. Although I recognize now with COVID, they probably wouldn't be doing something like that. So they would probably need 2 devices in the class. And speaking of that, having masks being worn in the classroom, it really signifies the need further for amplification devices for all students, just to be able to really help everybody be able to hear the classroom teacher or who's ever speaking at that point. But there are, yes, definitely ways that that should be addressed in the classroom. And my viewpoint is that if someone is teaching and there's someone in need of using an FM system, then they should be amplified at all times.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I just want to talk quickly about my participants in my research when it came to, as Denise had said, my dissertation research and what I found with the students talking about fatigue. So like I said, my students were in junior high and high school, so they ranged from age 13 to 18. There was a range from moderate to profound bilateral sensory neural hearing loss, which basically meant moderate, so kind of a mid hearing loss, to profound, which is almost hearing nothing, and without amplification, hearing nothing. And bilateral means both ears, and sensory neural loss, which is the inner ear. So they ranged from moderate to profound. All students were amplified in some way. So 3 had cochlear implants and 3 had hearing aids. They were all in mainstream classrooms in Alberta. 2 students communicated with me in ASL and used ASL, American Sign Language, in the classroom. So they had interpreters there to support them in the classroom. 3 used spoken English only, and 1 communicated using total communication, which for them was signed English, which is a little bit different than American Sign Language, and then spoken English as well. So they used signs to really support what they were saying in spoken English. And then I had 2 to 3 face-to-face interviews with all of the students. So after talking with them, we found 5 different themes that they had talked about. So there was listening effort, listening conditions, survival mechanisms, feeling that it wasn't worth the effort, and then what their effort expenditure actually looked like. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go through each theme, but only give 1 or 2 examples of what the participants said, so you have an idea of what they were actually experiencing in the classroom when it came to fatigue. So when it comes to listening effort, this was increased effort that students needed to listen or comprehend classroom conversations and the instruction of their teachers compared to their hearing peers. So Peter said, every day I have to concentrate on the interpreters, or when people talk to me, I have to concentrate on the words that they're saying to me. It's really tiring, and for some reason, I'm not able to stick it into my head. Not for a long time. He also went on to say, I don't like to sit and watch the interpreters all the time, because hearing people, they can move around or text or daydream, but for me, I have to watch and concentrate all the time. It's tiring, and if I turn around, I miss something, and I don't want to interrupt the class. I feel like it drains me out because I cannot use my natural language. I have to concentrate on the interpreter. Lip reading is very difficult for me. Well, I'm okay with a little bit of it at a time, but if it's like for a long time, then I just give up. And then with listening conditions, this is focused on environmental factors that really impact someone's ability to comprehend, so understand classroom instructions or conversations, typically because of the noise. So Mark said, when kids are very loud and the noise is like echoing in the room, then if the teacher tries to talk, I won't hear them because of the noise echoing in the classroom. All that noise can make it really hard to hear sometimes. So it was interesting to note too that it wasn't until I asked Mark specifically about his FM system, because he had said to me before that it often malfunctioned, that he kind of put 2 and 2 together about how it might have been contributing to him not being able to concentrate in that noisy classroom. So he said, yeah, it's like I'm trying to listen, but sometimes it's too noisy. And I don't know that I didn't know that I got tired because I was wearing my FM unit, but it's probably that. I try really hard to listen because a whole bunch of kids were like really loud. And I never thought about that before, but that's probably why. So then there's survival mechanisms. So these were the strategies that students used to cope with this overwhelming listening demands and fatigue. And I like this little image. My brain stopped functioning an hour ago. You're welcome to keep talking and I'll keep pretending to understand, because this is actually what we saw with the students. So Peter said, if I fall behind, I just give up and I nod. My mind is not able to work hard enough or fast enough to get the words together. And I'm only able to pick some pieces, but not the whole thing. And then Coley says, sometimes I'll pretend I'm listening, and sometimes I really am, but sometimes no. So you can see pretending to listen or to nod along in the classroom is really a maladaptive strategy, right? So you're up there teaching and you think it's going really well and students are nodding along. Yep, I get it. But sometimes they're really not even paying attention because they're just done at that point. And this brings us to this theme, which was not worth the effort. So this is one student said that those survival mechanisms they put into place weren't even effective anymore, that nodding along or just pretending to pay attention, and the participants completely disengaged. So Mark says, sometimes I think, what is the point? So I put my head down on the desk and I think about other things. And then when it came to effort expenditure, so regardless of whether participants used some type of amplification device or an interpreter, several of the students revealed that they felt higher levels of effort expenditure than their peers without some type of a hearing loss, and especially when they had to try to locate where these sound sources were coming from. So understanding teacher instructions, following classroom discussions, if their peers were talking, in that respect. So Coley says, I have to work harder to watching the interpreter. There's so much to catch up on. I have to rush to get my notes down and then learn it on my own. And I don't have time to learn it at the same time that I write it because I'm too busy writing what the interpreter says. So he can't even stop and say to the teacher, can you please slow down? Because he's so busy just trying to even catch up on what they're saying. So even if there is a small pause, there's no way for him to be able to be caught up enough to even ask for that little break. So I'm just going to pause here. I see a couple of things in the chat. So I'm just wondering if there's questions that people want to ask before we kind of get into what you can do as a teacher.
I think they were trying to get down the definitions of the different themes, but it looks like people have helped one another out there, but you may still have some questions.
Sure. Are there questions about it?
I was just wondering, there's a few students that lip read, and I'm wondering how they are coping, or what you've heard, if you've heard anything about how these students are coping, being that the teachers are wearing masks.
Yeah, and it's not even just students who lip read. I actually heard on the radio the other day that students in general, their language comprehension and comprehension and receptive skills were actually down because, and especially in like K-2 or K-3 classrooms, because they are missing out on the modeling of how teachers shape their mouths while they talk and produce sounds while they're reading, so that they're struggling with actually being able to produce those sounds themselves or produce them correctly because of the mask wearing. So there's that. There is an inability for individuals to lip read unless you get kind of those clear box masks, but even still there's difficulty with those. They tend to fog up. They're harder to actually breathe in for the instructors themselves, because it's almost like plexiglass being put in front of your mouth. So yes, there's been lots of difficulties for students in the classroom.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep going if people needed some more of these. Good. Emily, yes, go ahead.
Hi. I was just thinking about something. So when I was in elementary, one of my really good friends actually, as a kid, she was deaf, and so she had a cochlear implant, and then also because of that, there was like the microphone system. And I remember one time she lost one of the pieces. So like she had it, but then there was a little piece at the bottom. I don't know, she lost it, and so basically her CI wasn't working the whole week, and she was like afraid. She was like like so afraid to tell the teacher, the interpreter. She didn't want to tell her parents. Like she was like mortified. Like she was embarrassed, she was scared. And so for a whole week she just couldn't hear the teacher, and she just pretended that it was working.
Yeah.
And I've just been thinking about how, students with disabilities have to deal with the added stress of all of a sudden like potentially losing their ability to hear the teacher, and just like made me wonder what like social constructs would have led her to feel so embarrassed. Like what is it that students or teachers are doing that would make her feel like she's already such an inconvenience, that if she were to have lost that she would be like, of course it's an expensive device, but also just that she would be such an inconvenience. Yeah, I don't know if you have
Yeah.
anything about that to say, but that's just what I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an uncommon experience, unfortunately, with all 6 of these students that I was talking with. There was one who told me about a time where they had a substitute teacher come in, and they simply just didn't tell them that they were deaf. And the teacher hadn't left any notes or anything like that. So they just took their hearing aids off and went along the class just like, anybody else who didn't have any hearing needs. And the substitute teacher had no idea. So they were just like nodding along, pretending that they're engaging. They saw people laugh, so they would start laughing. And just didn't want that added stress of having to go to another person and say, look, I'm deaf, this is my needs, blah, blah, blah. And especially in junior high and high school, when, everybody just wants to fit in at that point, right? So having something else that's going to make them stand out is just something they don't want to have to deal with.
Yeah, and it was shocking like how good she was at pretending. We were like in grade 5. She was so good at pretending, and I knew she had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
But it just made me wonder, like, how many times have you pretended that you were, on the same page as everyone, but really you're just like, I have no idea what's going on. It's really
And the sad thing is that it happens at home a lot. I mean, with my brother, when we were younger, you don't really think about this too much. But now that we're older and we both kind of work in the field of, special education and students with diverse needs, my brother tells me all the time that at the supper table, we'd all be talking about our day. And he often was just nodding along. And then when it came time for him to talk, oh yeah, like this is how my day was, and that's it. And then we would just kind of move on. And but he said half the time he didn't even know what was happening in our days, because if we weren't thinking about it, we weren't signing to him. We were just talking because he had his hearing aids, and you don't think about it. Oh, he can hear us, it's fine. Or oh, I'll tell you later. And now he's like, that's language deprivation. You guys weren't actually telling me what was going on. I had no idea what was going on. The house could have been on fire and I had no idea. So I feel an extreme amount of guilt because of that now. And he always tells me, grow up, it's fine. But this is why I feel it's so important for teachers to know about it, for families to know about it, because I don't want anybody else to feel that same way. But definitely that it probably started at home, that she felt, and maybe not, but that she might have, had that experience of, yeah, I can fake it till I make it. And that's it. Yeah. Thanks, Emily. Yeah. Chelsea.
What would you recommend for us? A lot of us are potentially going to be going in and being subs at the beginning of our careers. So what would you recommend for us going into a classroom knowing that there's going to be some students who aren't going to communicate with us? The teacher might not have left us notes saying that they're hard of hearing or that they have other difficulties. Like,
Yeah.
do you just walk in and say, "Hey, has anybody got problems?" Or like, what?
Well,
what do you do?
I don't know if I would do that. I feel like
Yeah.
you might get a whole bunch of hands coming up, or maybe none at all at that point. But I mean, in a lot of ways, it's the classroom teacher's responsibility, right? To be able to let you in on things that go on in their classroom, because you don't know what you don't know. You could stop at the principal's office, you know, and say, hey, is there anything I should know about some of the students in this class? But you know, they might not even be available at that point. Or so it's really hard coming in as a substitute to really be able to plan ahead, to know what you're walking into or anything like that. But I mean, if you're able to have a conversation with the classroom teacher, which sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't, depending on your relationship with the school, you could be asking ahead of time, like, is there something I need to know about? Are there any devices that I need to be wearing, like an FM system, or, you know, just bringing up questions like that. If you're able to, that's probably a good place to start. But again, it really falls on that classroom teacher. If there is an educational assistant in the classroom, though, who is focused simply on that class, or maybe comes in from time to time, you could ask them, like, hey, who are you here to work with? Is there something that I can do to support you further? Things like that. But again, you won't really know that unless you're there in the class already.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So have you all, I think you all have done your Universal Design for Learning module. I can't see anyone's faces, so it's hard for me to know. Can someone unmute and let me? Okay, thumbs up, thank you, that helps. So you all have heard of Universal Design for Learning, so I don't really need to go through that too much. But this is the way that I'm really going to be focusing what you can do as teachers, starting with that idea of universal design for learning, because we know that this is creating a flexible environment for students, and it's thinking about it ahead of time to make sure that there's accessibility for all the students in your class. So I'm structuring, you know, what you can do in this format. I don't know if you've heard of Shelley Moore, if you've talked about her at all in the class, but she drew on literature from positive behavior support when she talked about having to use a personal, social, and intellectual purpose for your students. So personal being personal awareness and responsibility, personal identity or culture. Social being communication, or again, social responsibility, and then intellectual being creative thinking or critical thinking, and then putting the three different aspects of universal design for learning with this. So under personal, multiple means of representation. So again, adapting for different sensory needs in the classroom, or adjusting the environment to making sure that everybody has physical access either to the curriculum or to the classroom itself. The engagement, flexibility, and the content to reflect obviously their interests, and maybe some type of collaboration with the students, educators, or parents themselves. And then for action and expression, having again those flexibility of assessments, you all know this, and then flexibility in their knowledge of the content as well, right? So hopefully that's a general overview. And then thinking about what you can actually do for the students and in these specific situations. So under that personal responsibility, so being for the students and also for you as the teachers, being aware of what those fatigue symptoms are for students. And then potentially being able to identify the sources of fatigue, right? So the symptoms, what are they showing? Are they starting to yawn more? Do they rub their eyes? Are they starting to act out a little bit because they're really frustrated at this point? And then sources of fatigue. Is it particular classes that you notice the students getting really fatigued in? Maybe you had just read a section of a novel or a textbook, or focused on something for an extended amount of time. Do they really seem to be extra fatigued now? Is it more of a physical sense where they were typing, like I said, for an extended period of time, or really focusing on maybe an interpreter or some type of image or demonstration? What could those sources potentially be? For multiple means of engagement, collaborating with students to understand how the fatigue might be impacting their social situations. and then how to rectify that for them. So when it comes to the social emotional fatigue, a lot of students were saying how it affected their relationships, and they were so focused on that cognitive or the physical essence in the classroom. When it came to having to talk with their peers or to hang out with them after school or even at recess or at lunch, students were just exhausted, and they didn't have the energy then to spend talking to their friends. And sometimes their friends would get mad at them and say, like, what, you don't want to talk to me anymore? What the heck is going on? Like, just thinking that they're being rude about it. But they literally didn't have the energy to even try to drum up a conversation, you know, and that could have been Emily, like your friend, sitting there in the classroom, like, I'm just done. Like, I don't even want to bother with this. You know, it's been a week. You know, I'll just deal with it, right? And I would love to know how she felt after that week. Like, did she feel guilty for missing all of that, or did she actually feel a sense of kind of reprieve from that week, that, hey, I got to kind of relax and I didn't really have to worry too much? It would probably be one or the other.
I think she ended up feeling bad because when she did tell, the thing is, it kind of didn't work out great for her, because when she did tell someone that she lost it, I convinced her to tell, you know, her interpreter, and they were pretty upset with her that she waited so long. Like, I think it was ironic because she didn't want them to be upset for her for losing it, but then they basically were like more upset for her that she didn't tell them that she lost it for a week, and like, you should have told us sooner. And then she still felt bad, and then maybe was like, oh, maybe I should have told them. But I think, yeah, there was lots of days where she was like, I think I'm just gonna tell her, and then she was like just afraid, so she didn't. And
Yeah.
eventually she was like, it's too late. Well, because they ended up digging through, like, they figured she dropped it on the floor and the janitors had swept it up, so her and the interpreter ended up like digging through garbage, like bags from the week that hadn't been like taken away yet, and they actually found it in a garbage bag, which was
Wow.
amazing. But yeah, so I think they were like, this would have been easier if you know, we wouldn't have to dig through all this garbage. We could maybe have found it that day. But
Yeah. Oh, man. Great, thanks.
And Chelsea has just put in the chat a really good comment on this. It's frustrating that they got upset with her instead of questioning why she might not have said anything. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you saying that, Chelsea, is, I mean, that shows how intuitive you would be as a teacher. I think a lot of times, you know, teachers just kind of want to get the lesson done. We have, you know, X amount of days to get this curriculum focused on and get through this material and all of that. And so it's more of, hey, you didn't get any of this material. Now, you know, now maybe I have to spend more time making sure you're caught up and all that, right? And getting flustered because of that, without thinking, well, why wouldn't you want to tell us that, right? So yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point, Chelsea. And that actually kind of feeds right in, so I'll pay you $1 later, but feeds right into the multiple means of engagement under the intellectual ownership. So for us as teachers, supporting students to self-advocate their communication needs, right, in order to rectify fatigue. So if they're able to, in that personal side, be aware of maybe what those fatigue symptoms are, or when they start to feel fatigued, if they feel like they're in a safe enough space to self-advocate and say, hey, you know, I'm really starting to feel fatigued, I need a break, or I need something, then that's something that we should really be advocating for the students to do, right? To be able to say, look, this is what I need, and this is what I need from you as my teacher. And a big thing is providing breaks to students throughout the day, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that's something that's really important, that we found the research really focus on, but also students say quite a bit themselves. And then with that idea of fatigue for action and expression, really that idea of flexible timing for assessments is huge, because there's some students who are saying that, you know, the fatigue really affects them early in the morning, right? Depending on what they've done in the morning, maybe they have a long bus route or something like that. Whereas by the end of the day, most of them were just plain exhausted, right? Some of them before lunch too, again, depending on the classes that they had before and after. So if you know that, you know, this, you're assessing them at the end of the school day, know that a lot of students aren't going to be their best at that point, right? So if you have some flexibility in that timing, then that would be ideal for the students themselves. So recommendations specifically from the students were to offer frequent breaks, alternate between whole class and small group lessons, combining auditory, visual, and kinesthetic learning opportunities. So we know multimodal learning, right, within lessons, and reducing speaker overlap in classroom discussions. So when it comes to these frequent breaks, I often have teachers stop me at this point and say, okay, well, how frequent is frequent? Like, are we stopping every 5 minutes to let them have a 5-minute break? Because how am I going to get through my content then? But this is how teachers can tie it into their classroom day. So I think it was Chelsea, no, it was somebody else. Someone had said about the mindfulness. So this is a way a teacher can tie it in, right? Giving students those breaks throughout the classroom and having them focus on, you know, me time. If you're exhausted, maybe where you were starting to feel that, giving them a sense of a break can really help them to come back and focus in the classroom, right? Some students need those mental breaks where they can just turn their brain off. Some students need time to go socialize because that's kind of what rejuvenates them. Some students will need to go take a walk so they have a physical, something to physically prompt them to get up and go. And again, some students will put their heads down on the desk. If they have amplification devices, they might turn them off. Just giving students a time to be able to really do that for themselves. And if you know something's going to be, you're going to have some type of a really heavy load, like if it's language arts or maybe social studies, something that's really text focused or they really have to be focusing on for a long time, then knowing that maybe you should give them a break after that could really help a lot of students, or even before or both that lesson to begin with as well, just to be able to prepare students for the time that they're going to be sitting focused on that. Monica, it was you that had talked about mindfulness. Yes, please unmute.
Yeah, I had talked about mindfulness, and as you speak, I remember this was actually it was a practicum school, I believe. Yeah. So 2 teachers had it worked out. When a boy needed a break, they would have this book bin, and the boy was responsible to go and take this book bin to the grade 6 classroom. But it was code to the other teacher that boy just needed a break and a walk. And then at the end of the day, the grade 6 teacher would return the book bin to the grade 3 teacher. And it was just a little arrangement they had made up that greatly helped the student and made him feel really useful. So I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, and you know, I love hearing stories like that, but at the same time, I question what's happening in the classroom when that student is going to deliver that book bin. Because if everybody gets to have a break at that point, then that's great, because he's not then, or they're not then missing the content that's going on. But if the teacher continues to teach during that time, then that student's now being put at a disadvantage, right? So that's why I often say to teachers, if we're going to do these mental breaks or these cognitive breaks, whatever you want to call them, sometimes they call them physical breaks and they do some, you know, dancing or whatever. If you're going to do if you're going to do that break, it needs to be for everybody, right? And if students need additional breaks, then we need to make sure that there's some way, if that lesson is still being taught, that they're going to be able to catch up on that material. Or maybe they've already kind of been doing that material, working with an EA or something, and then they're already caught up on it, so they can go take 5 minutes, you know, something to just make sure that no student then is being put at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that particular student had hit the wall. He could no longer, like, mentally hit the wall. He could no longer participate, so he needed a break until he could re-engage. But I understand what you're saying, that you have to make sure they don't miss anything important when they're gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of times when students are going to hit that proverbial wall, right? And sometimes physical wall as well, when they are just done, absolutely done, and they can't do it anymore. And it's our job as teachers to hopefully get to the students before that wall hits, right? Before they hit that wall, so that we can safely make sure that all students are able to really be engaged in the classroom, right? So again, it's really knowing those learner profiles of our students, and maybe even some of these fatigue symptoms, and watching sometimes that slippery slope start to happen, right? Because as soon as they start to feel that fatigue, it goes downhill pretty quickly. I see some more hands up. There's maybe some in the chat, and then Chelsea as well.
I'm just wondering if you have any advice on, like, if you know that you're about to have a heavy lesson or like one that might be a little longer, might require more focus. How would you go about like kind of warning your students that that is coming up so that they're not like sitting there the whole time wondering, will this ever end? Like they kind of know when it's ending.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I said, I would probably provide a break before and after. And even, before you're about to start the lesson, just say like, we're really going to focus now this next 20 minutes or 25 minutes. We really need to be engaged. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a break now. So let's get everything we need to get out and let's, try to buckle down and focus. And knowing that for some students, their focus time is going to be 5 minutes, right? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe. So you might have to have something that breaks up the lesson in between. So again, using the multimodal learning within that lesson would be great. So maybe they can have some type of visual aspect that goes along with it, right? So they've been reading for a chunk. Now let's look at a picture maybe that relates to it, and how can we, talk about how this content is now translated to this picture, or something just to break it up a little bit, to give them a little bit of a reprieve, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything in the chat? It's likely everyone needs a break anyway. Absolutely. It's one of those memes that you need this, right? Okay, so developing appropriate mechanisms, coping mechanisms. So for students, again, like you saw in those examples, a lot of students were just getting to the point where they would nod along. They would fake it till they make it, really. And then eventually they would disengage because it's obviously not an appropriate coping mechanism. So they need something. So like you need to sit down with a student or the EA or all of you together, maybe even the parent, and talk about what's going to be appropriate for the student. Because again, every student's going to need something different. Some will need to go take a walk. Some might literally need to put their head down for a little bit, turn off amplification. Maybe they need to go outside and run around for a second, right? That might not always be able to happen. So we need to figure out different ways and coping mechanisms where a student can just say, I'm about ready to be done. I need something here. And so building in those breaks and making sure you alternate, kind of like I said, with a small group, whole group, that's going to help a lot. But there's still going to be times when students are going to need mechanisms for themselves. So understanding what those are for individual students and trying to set up a plan with them is really key. So recommendations from the research, that was all from the students. Those were all suggestions from students. And then this is what has been found in research. So knowing a student's learning style and rolling with it and sticking with it, right? So tap into ways of learning that we know suit them best, right? The way students, tend to gravitate towards so that they can use their energy learning, the energy that they're going to put forth for learning in the most effective way, right? If we know that they prefer something over something else, then maybe we can really try to engage them more with that. Breaking down larger pieces of work into smaller chunks, scheduling breaks and sticking with them, and then again, being aware of students' fatigue symptoms and triggers. So it's funny that a lot of these that are coming from the research are similar to what students are saying. And by the time these students hit junior high and high school, they've been trying to use these maladaptive coping strategies for years and years at this point. So they're starting to figure out what works for them, and maybe they don't realize still what doesn't, but it's interesting that they still have the wherewithal to be giving us the recommendations that are lining up with research, right? So it's clear that their lived experiences are something we should be really taking into consideration and honing in on what they need and asking them really what they need. Another thing that I talked about really quickly was that we need to help students to self-advocate, right? Tell me as your teacher what you need and what you need me to do to support you in the school, right? So giving them frequent opportunities to develop these self-advocacy skills and teaching students their right to access. Right. So again, some of these students who had teachers who didn't want to use FM systems, some of them knew that, no, this isn't right. I need to go to my mom. I need to go to the principal and say, like, this is not okay. I need that FM system to learn, and you are not providing that for me. Whereas other students might just think, you know, the teacher's the boss of the class, and if they don't want to use it, I kind of just have to sit here and deal with it. So making sure students know the rights that they have in the classroom, and then how to effectively advocate for themselves, right? Going around yelling at everybody might cause a scene, but might not necessarily help with getting things done. But knowing, you know, who to go to and how to actually ask for what they need is important, and promoting independence. A lot of times, you might find those helicopter parents who want to swoop in and say, my child needs this. And it's like, yes, I understand your child needs this, but I would also love it if your child would come and tell me that they need that as well, right? So helping students, helping to have them promote that independence as well.
Hi, I was just thinking about the situation that I mentioned before, and probably the thing that I could have done is just to ask the student if both the teachers were aware of that, because I understand that sometimes they are really shy, and just as you said, the teacher is the boss of the classroom and I cannot ask for anything. And some of the students come to our class knowing that sometimes they are not entitled to ask or things like that. I have seen students who are they vocalize whatever they need, but I have seen other students that they don't say anything, not to bother you, not to be an annoyance in the classroom. And I experienced that with my children. At home, yes, they tell me whatever they want, but in the classroom, they don't want to say anything. And I know, and this was great too. So they are just learning how to navigate the world, and probably the student was not aware of that. And I guess that this is an important message for me to be able to learn how I can deal with that again the next time. And I say this because I also see my son, who is in grade 3. He's very shy. He doesn't say what he needs. He instead keeps it inside. And I don't think that that's a good thing for our students to keep that inside.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. The hard part is with students who are in, you know, kindergarten to grade 3, they still, you know, really see the teacher as can do no wrong, right? Like it's moving the authority figure from parent to teacher, right? They kind of hold them in the same respect. It's not until like maybe starting grade 3, 4, 5 where they start to kind of push back a little bit. And that's typically when students start to understand, oh, maybe the teacher doesn't know everything. Maybe I can actually say something to the teacher and they'll start to see how I feel about it, right? So yeah, sometimes it's just that age, but it's really important, especially if students have differing learning needs, that there's that advocacy that's being taught to them to understand what they might need that could be different from their peers, or might not even be different from their peers. Their peers could benefit from also having that, but they don't necessarily know that as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm seeing in the chat, Monica saying that I think we need to model what we do as people when we are fatigued. Yeah, I would agree with that. But at the same time, we might not notice yet when the students are starting to be fatigued too, right? If we don't have learning differences or different learning needs, our level of fatigue might come a lot later than the students who have differing learning needs, right? So yes, I think it's a great model of what we can do, but it might happen at a later time. And so we need to be really cognizant of exactly what we're modeling and when that's happening as well. But I think that's a really good point. I train our kids from young to state your case. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, state your case. So tell me what you need, and hopefully people will listen to that, right? Great. So I'm wrapping it up here, and then we can have some discussion if we'd like. But clearly there is need for further research in this area. And like I said, I've focused specifically my research on students who are deaf or hard of hearing. I've started to open it up a little bit to students who have ADHD, but still mainly focused on students who are deaf or hard of hearing with additional needs. But it just shows that there's a lot of research to be done in this area. and that opening vignette that I talked to you about of being in the 301 classroom and the students really having no concept of what others might be facing in terms of fatigue in the classroom shows that it's important for us as educators to really develop that awareness of fatigue challenges in general, and to be able to accurately recognize and really discern, like I said, those coping behaviors to provide supports that are really appropriate to students before they get to that exhausted state and then disengage, right? We really need to catch them before that has started to happen. A big thing is that classroom language, it really needs to be developed to allow students to be able to ask for what they need and to be able to recognize those fatigue signs and symptoms in themselves as well. So being able to have open and honest conversations with students about, if you're starting to feel this way, I need to know, and we'll try to switch things up is really important. And I think the last thing that I want to say is that you as educators, us as educators, we're really in a unique position where we can provide those supports to the students to be able to really alleviate their fatigue symptoms, or at least teach them how to cope better with them. And I think that even though my focus has been specifically on challenges faced by students, I hope that you as educators will think about what fatigue means for you as well, and how you can deal with that for yourself in the classroom as well. Because if you're starting to be fatigued in the classroom, that's not going to be beneficial for your students as well. So hopefully classroom environments and instruction can all benefit from understanding what fatigue is and how we can try to alleviate some of these symptoms, or at least come up with coping strategies for ourselves and for students as well. So that's my talk. Any questions, comments?
Thank you so much. It was very interesting to hear all that, and also to at least to make us aware of the dangers that we can have in the classroom. I call it danger is just because sometimes we might not be aware that there is a child who is deaf or hard of hearing, and they need extra help. And I have seen that. And for example, going back to the example that you were telling us about the student who sometimes just go with it, and he doesn't, or she doesn't know what else to do, but just remove the devices and everything. And that's something that I saw with this particular girl as well. But I didn't know exactly what was happening. I wasn't quite equipped as I am now, I feel, to be able to help her. So right now, with all the information that you have provided, I think that I would be able to help a little bit more.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think the biggest thing is that there's awareness of what fatigue is, and that's the first step for all educators, is that we need to know that fatigue exists for students. And after we understand what that could look like for students, then that's how we can really help to support students in the classroom. So absolutely, that's if I were to do an intervention study, that's the first thing I would do, is just to make teachers aware that this actually exists, and then kind of what to do with it. So yeah. Monica?
Yeah, I just wanted to state that I think I put in the chat, like, we should model what we do when we're like having fatigue. But I think what I meant was to brainstorm, like, so to brainstorm, okay, when I'm fatigued after a day, I go to the ranch, I ride my horse, I take my dog for a walk, I go for a swim. So mine tend to be exercise based. But other students might look at art or music, or just like having a rest, or going chilling with friends. So I think that could be like an open brainstorm, maybe even a health class about, actually, I think that is in grade 4 health, how to cope with stress, isn't it? Yeah, so that's what I meant, an open discussion on a brainstorm, so that people don't feel singled out and they personally know their avenues of dealing with stress.
That's a really great point. I mean, I think even a whole lesson around that on this is when I start feeling like this way, you know, I could be stressed, I could be fatigued, and then what do I need to do after this? What are some things that I have done, maybe some things that haven't worked, and some things like I would like to try in the future, right? I think that's a really, really great idea. Yeah.
Thank you, Natalia.
Yeah, you're welcome. Juanita?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that too. But even, for example, when I think about a specific grade, I don't think that, I think that everybody would benefit from this, even if we started at kindergarten level. And to tell the students to educate them that if they have a certain need, they need to communicate that to their teacher. And also as a future educator, I guess that the best thing that we can do is to establish a positive relationship with the students so they feel that they can tell us anything and not feel like another load to us and another problem that is going to be added to the classroom. So I think that that would be helpful for us as teachers to have better relationships with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why, you know, in 301, I feel that there's so many important concepts that you all as students really need to focus on. And I think the biggest one is understanding the learner profile and then having that place for a student to be able to come to you and have that comforting relationship so that they know there's somebody there on their side that they can come to if they need it. Absolutely.
Sorry, can I just add a point before you ask your question, Chelsea? And that sort of brings me back to, remember last class, I was just talking about creating a class profile. Mm-hmm. So this kind of information about student needs could be in your class profile. And that way, if a substitute teacher's coming in, you could have your class profile available for them. So that information is there. You don't have to write it out again. You just say, have a look at the class profile. I've got, 5 students that have particular needs you'll need to be aware of. So there's another important value for creating a class profile. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a kind of a comment about I'm just thinking about the just go for it mentality that you're talking about, and how a lot of kids will be struggling, but they'll just go with it and pretend that they're not. And I've noticed it's a mentality that's super reinforced in girls specifically over boys. So a lot of girls will go like undiagnosed with neurodivergencies or other learning problems because they're socialized to just kind of accept it and go with it. And I'm just wondering if you have any like suggestions on how we can kind of like specifically talk to girls about this and how we can kind of break them of that habit to just go with it instead of communicating that they're struggling.
That is such a great question. I don't know if I have any specific strategies specifically for girls, but I feel like with students who have disabilities in general, I think a lot of them are kind of being pushed on this go get it attitude, you have to work through it and you have to work harder than everybody else, but you can do it. And look at all these success stories that we see on the internet. And I think it's allowing, especially with fatigue, it's allowing the student to just kind of be who they are and understand what works for them and what doesn't. And sometimes understanding that it's okay to stop and need a rest and to just take care of yourself, right? And so I think that's the biggest focus, is that they need to understand kind of what works for them and what doesn't. And if that includes having to stop in the middle of a lesson, then that's what it's going to be for them, right? And if they need that rest, which the majority of them do, then they should feel okay with taking it, and that there's nothing wrong with getting the supports that you need at that point. So, and I think that should be that way with everybody, right? Whether they're
Absolutely.
male, female.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to come back to an important point you made in terms of like this whole fatigue awareness, because one of the things that Natalia found in her PhD research was that the students didn't have the language in order to talk about fatigue. And so we only discovered this because she went back and did 2 and 3 interviews with them. And so often in her first interview, she would use language that connected what the student was feeling with fatigue. And so then when she would go back to her second and third interview, because she'd given the students the language, they actually then talked about it. They'd actually thought about it. And I think we're still in that same position in our schools because fatigue isn't sort of normalized. Kids may be experiencing it, but they don't have the words to even tell you. They don't have the words to tell you they're experiencing it. They don't have the words then to self-advocate. So starting at that point of giving them words, language to use to actually describe this is the place that's going to make the biggest difference in changing that.
I completely agree. And the thing is, when we start young, we often use words like tired, which is fine because that's a concept students can understand, right? Especially younger students. But then eventually it's moving away from that because a lot of times students, like I had said earlier, will internalize that and say, well, I couldn't fall asleep last night. I read 2 books instead of 1 before bed, and I was a little wired up, or Dad let me watch a bit of the hockey game last night, and whatever it is, right? I'm just thinking of my own 5-year-old son and what riled him up before bed. And then he'll wake up in the morning and say, Mom, I'm so tired because, I stayed up a little extra late last night. And like, he understands that concept, right? But if we're talking about that in a classroom sense, he comes home from kindergarten and he like has to lay on the couch for a little bit. And I mean, this is a neurotypical 5-year-old boy for the most part, and he needs to come home and kind of disengage with life for a little bit. So I can just imagine what other students are feeling in the classroom. And so making sure that they're not just internalizing it, though, is a big thing. And I think at that age, there's still that idea of, oh, it's my fault, right? And that tends to be persistent throughout. So again, yeah, giving that language to start to understand, maybe it's something you're not doing, right? Maybe it's not you at all. Maybe there's something that went on at school that's causing you to feel this way, right? So, yeah.
I think because we've got a little bit of time, the students might be interested in your current research, because I suspect that some of them going out as future teachers might end up part of the research or be interested in participating in the research or even utilize the research.
Sure, yeah. So Denise and I are working together on creating a measure of fatigue for students, right now focused specifically on students who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so that classroom teachers, parents, and students themselves, and potentially outside professionals who are working with them, like psychologists or speech language pathologists, will be able to have some type of a checklist to be able to go through and identify if they feel that the student, what their levels of fatigue actually are in the classroom, and then talking about different strategies for them to be able to kind of cope with this or mitigate those feelings in the classroom. And so right now we are in the process of, we just finished interviewing parents and professionals, and I'm missing another group, but we just finished talking with them and are starting to develop the questions of the actual survey itself. And then after we have what we think is kind of a good draft, we're going to go back to them and see what they think about our questions. And then we're going to try to pilot it with classroom teachers all throughout Alberta and see how it kind of fares with how students who are deaf or hard of hearing are feeling in the classroom, and if it's really getting a good gauge of the fatigue that they're showing there. And then hopefully after we get something put together for that, we're going to try to broaden the idea for students outside of the category of deaf or hard of hearing, for students with all different types of needs. So that's kind of where we're at with that. And I mean, there's quite a few measures of fatigue out there right now already. Most of them focus on, like I had said earlier with the research, on students, not students, even children or adults who are going through medical crises or interventions, a lot that have to do with multiple sclerosis or cancers, that type of fatigue, mostly a physical. There's another fatigue scale kind of coming through focused on students who are deaf or hard of hearing, but they're only focusing on those who use spoken language. So it's just focused on listening fatigue. And we're wanting to do more of a holistic approach. So it's focusing on any type of language needs and focusing on the 3 areas. So instead of just cognitive fatigue, we're looking at cognitive, physical, and social emotional as well. Because we really feel like in order to find the needs of an individual, you really need to know who they are as a holistic whole person. So just looking at one category doesn't really work so well. So that's kind of what we're doing with our research right now. And yeah, we might end up coming to you in your classrooms if you have students who are deaf or hard of hearing in your classrooms, or if we just need control groups, we might be out there coming to see you. So keep an eye out. And if you're interested in learning more about the research, actually, I can put that slide back up, and you can contact me about that if you'd like. So that is my contact information there. So I welcome any further questions if you have, or again, like I said, feel free to email me and we can chat about that as well. So thank you for inviting me today, and good luck in your future classes.
Thanks very much, Natalia. This was a great addition to the 301 course, and it fits perfectly in with the concepts I'm talking about right now, which is purpose in place. So we just actually talked about, or I had talked about, I shouldn't use the we, I had talked about personal, social, and intellectual purposes just last class.
Perfect timing. It's like we work together.